Morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here and to talk a little bit about our work. I divided the talk this morning into two parts. One, as David mentioned, the gateway we're running now is pretty successful by several measures, and people often ask me to talk a bit about why it's successful. And so there will be a first half of the talk which is rather tactical. You know, how did we come to be where we are? Why are we? And how did we accomplish what we accomplished? And then the second part is a little more aspirational. What's the future hold for Cypress? Where's the next level in gateway computing? So with that in mind, I'll just start off and say I've explored both sides of success in creating gateways. My first attempt did not go as well as Cypress, and I thought it might be useful just sort of to explore when things don't go well when you're creating a gateway, and why they don't go well. And then I'll move on to what I think we did well with Cypress that we didn't do so well with my first attempt. And the first attempt was called the Next Generation Biology Workbench. The workbench word seems to be missing here, but anyway, and that was an interesting project. And when we started, what happened is, as a biologist, our goal was to provide new services for biology, but the developers had somewhat of a different goal. Their goal was to develop the most generic software package ever for gateway instantiation. And so anything that wasn't generic couldn't be implemented as far as they were concerned. And that slowed our time to market down quite a bit. Okay, so that was problematic. Another thing that we did was ignore new researchers in the community. And when we had an existing user base, there was an original biology workbench, and ours was to be the next generation one. And we were remaking that in a somewhat incremental way. And what we learned when we completed our version and released it was the people who were using the existing one were really happy with the tools there and really didn't want to stop and relearn a new web interface, and they didn't really want to remake all their lesson plans. A lot of instructors were using the biology workbench. And so basically we recreated something that wasn't really needed, in the sense that the existing one was working well enough for its users. We weren't going to attract those users. So again, the focus on updating an existing gateway's capabilities wasn't really great. We didn't offer a huge jump capability. We focused on the low-end computational use cases that the original biology workbench was designed for and the classroom use. Again, people were happy with the existing one and really didn't want to move away from it. And finally, we failed to anticipate the emerging needs of biologists for genomics tools. So the whole idea of big data that's very common now, driven in large measure by next generation DNA sequencing techniques, we pretty much ignored those needs or were unaware of them. And then finally, our codes were running in serial on a small server. We didn't really grasp the importance of parallel codes and time savings at that point. Largely because I'm a biologist and I wasn't really indoctrinated into the HPC world at that time. So that didn't work out so well for us. The NGBW closed in 2013. It wasn't refunded. It met the needs of low-end use cases. It had its fans, but it was primarily supporting advanced high school students through their instructors. And in the end, that's really not enough to keep you going. Okay, so that's how to make things go badly. But it wasn't a total loss, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But we embarked on a better pathway for gateway development with the CIPRES Science Gateway. And in doing that, we had a tiny amount of funding to get it started. And we really engaged only in user and use case development because we didn't have much funding. We were just like, what's the minimum thing we can put up and make users happy? And when we got requests from users, we paid attention and we did what we could to meet their needs. And as their needs were met and people began to arrive at the site for things they couldn't get elsewhere, we were able to expand our capacity to meet their growing demands. And we always paid attention to high-end rather than low-end users. We weren't we meet the needs of a lot of low-end users, but our favorite people are the people who come with a use case that doesn't quite fit into our interface. And so they'll contact me, and I'll refer them to someone on our staff, and we'll do things behind the scenes manually for them. So we understand what's the problem they have that isn't working in the interface. And because we're assuming when somebody brings you one problem like that, there's a bunch of people out there already or will be soon who are asking you for the same kinds of solutions. And so this is really instructive for us, and it also gives us a lot of pleasure to help people and then see the publication appear, and they send us candy and thanks or whatever, but anyway, it's fun. And then refactoring the infrastructure as use cases arrive. Like I said, the things that are one-off solutions in the beginning, as the users arrive, their needs change, the data size change. I'll talk more about that. But what we refactored the infrastructure in response to that, rather than imagining, we didn't start by imagining what's the biggest use case we can imagine and build to that. We've let as the use cases arrive, we've let that drive our development. And that's kept our costs down and allowed us to focus really on the areas that we absolutely have to resolve to stay alive. And so it's not, for a developer, it's not like maybe as exciting because there's not as much time to think about some of the more elegant solutions, but it's more of a tactical, down in the trenches kind of solution that we're looking for. And you know, this sort of refers back to the first thing I said. It's really the same. We build in response to user requests, or when the usage patterns that they've developed or have appeared on our doorstep are breaking the existing infrastructure. And I'll give you some examples of that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so interestingly, the current CIPRES Gateway wasn't originally built on the same software as the NGBW, but it inherited it. It was built as a generic platform, which is, it slowed it down, but it was useful as a result of that, and I'll show you where in a second. But the difference was our focus was, you know, user-driven development. Okay, so, and as David mentioned, Cypress has been successful. Our metrics for that are given here in bullet point form. We've had 15,000 users submit more than 500,000 jobs to TerraGrid. It was originally named TerraGrid, now it's called XSEDE in the US. And those are large HPC resources. And that's since December of 2009, so we're pushing on to 6 years now. In the last 12 months, an average of 350 new XSEDE users registered in each of the in each of those months. So we're growing quickly, and really our users currently make up about 30% of all the XSEDE users in number. In terms of resources consumed, it's much less than that. It's maybe 1%. But you know, over that time, we've distributed 100 million core hours of computational time to individual scientists, and we've supported 1,800 publications to date. And based on our user surveys, 50% of our users tell us they have no other way of running these jobs, and another 30% tell us that we speed up what they're doing. So if you think about that number, about 900 of those publications don't appear at all, and about 450 or 500 of them appear slower. So we're having some impact with really fairly modest amount of resources, maybe 30,000 core hours per publication, maybe 50, somewhere in that range. And we're also used to deliver curriculum by undergraduate instructors, and as of the last survey, 76 people reported using it in the last year. Okay, so we've had some good success there. And so talking about, you know, why is this gateway successful, and what can be learned from how we've done it? I'll just cover the tactics here. It's high-level stuff, but it's what I do. I find it interesting. The first step, of course, is to identify a user population in need. Who are our users, and what do we bring them? And as David mentioned, our resources for phylogenetics research. For those of you who may not know, phylogenetics is really the study of the evolution of life on Earth. And so the basic question that we're studying is, how do you get from this original primordial single cell to humans and to all the other many-celled and single-celled organisms that exist on the planet. How does that, and really it touches every field of biology. It's an underlying principle in everything that we're studying as biologists today. Okay, so how do we study that, and why do they need us? There are two algorithmic tasks that are important in phylogenetic research that are computationally intensive. And the first one is called sequence alignment. You take a set of DNA sequences from closely or distantly related species and try to assign the evolutionarily equivalent letters in the DNA sequence. And it's much like a whale's right flipper is the equivalent of my right arm. What we're doing with sequence alignment algorithms is trying to decide which letter in this sequence matrix is evolutionarily equivalent to the one in the sequence below it. And there has to be enough relatedness to detect that. And so here you see the vertical alignment with the, with the identically colored vertical stripes, right? Those are evolutionarily equivalent letters, and where they're colored all the same color, they're evolutionarily conserved throughout all species in question. And where there are white spaces or other colors appearing, there have been evolutionary changes, or changes that we attribute to evolution, making each sequence slightly different than the one above or below it. Okay, so that's sequence alignment. And then from that, from the number of differences between them, we make some assumptions about how those changes occur. And there are several methodologies for doing that, several kinds of assumptions. And I won't talk about that right now. But the idea is, based on the differences between them and some other assumptions, we can create a timeline, or it's really a phylogenetic tree. It's an acyclic directed graph that gives you an idea of how long ago each of these species shared a common ancestor, an ancestor that we can't see because it no longer exists, but how long ago they diverged from one another based on the changes in the DNA sequence. So that's sequence alignment and tree inference. And let's see, yeah. So what does that mean for computational biologists? Really, the rate of DNA sequencing is explosive right now. The cost is dropping quickly. And so we can sequence DNA as we need to sequence it, pretty much. It's not all done yet. There's certainly lots to do. But people are now sequencing at the genome scale rather than at the gene scale. So there's a ton of information out there that we can use for phylogenetic inference. Okay, and both sequence alignment and tree inference are intrinsically NP hard. That's been shown. And even with the heuristics that we can use to make that a little simpler to solve these problems, all the community codes that exist today scale exponentially, both with the number of species and the number of columns in the matrix that I showed you. So the length of the DNA and the number of species that you're looking at. We have lots of data. Those numbers are increasing in terms of availability, but we need a lot of computational power to address how we get the trees out of those. Okay, so phylogenetic codes that have historically been run in desktop environments need to be moved to high-performance computing resources, or we have to have a way of accessing computing resources to do that. And the need is going to increase. DNA sequences is increasing at an exponential or even super exponential rate right now. So the need for access is going to increase for the foreseeable future. And anyone who doesn't have that kind of access is going to have to tailor their questions that they can ask to available resources, and therefore risk being left out of the competitive discovery process. So this is our community. It's like access to HPC or die. So this is a good community to try to serve, because all you have to do is not get in the way too much, because they need you to survive. And when I was initially on the CIPRES project, CIPRES stands for Cyber Infrastructure for Phylogenetic Research. People would, whenever we were at meetings or even just hanging out, people would contact us and say, when are you going to give us some access? We're dying out here. We need resources. And finally, the management heard them and decided, of the project heard them and decided to construct a portal that would start to help them and meet their needs. And that's where my story here starts. Only a small amount of resources were allocated for the task, as I mentioned. And so we focused on a really simple workflow. Our workflow is a lot analogous to like taking your clothes to the dry cleaner. You know, the dry cleaner can do one kind of cleaning you can't do for yourself. And I think we're directly analogous, and they'll store it for you as long as you want, and they'll turn it around for you and just keep it there until you're ready for it. So basically, to do this kind of work, there's an enormous amount of work involved in assembling the sequences that you want to align. But those things are low computational demand. And there's many ways to do them. So users have their own preferred methods, and we don't really want to be in that business because we want to provide them the one thing they can't manage on their own. Okay, so once they've got that done, they can upload their data sets to the portal. And luckily, phylogenetic data sets are modest in size. They're typically tens to hundreds of megabytes and not larger. We'll store those for them. You can run their alignment. You can run your tree inference. You can leave them in storage indefinitely and then download them. And then you have your own set of tools that are, again, computationally not terribly expensive to do the analysis of that, the visualization and modification. And of course, these things go in cycles, so people can do their post-analysis and then reload, do their analysis in a slightly different way. So that's the basic workflow we've focused on and hung to until, well, up till the present, really. And okay, so we've identified a user population in need, and we've identified what their basic need is, and now we're just committing to responding to the user's needs as things go. And so we hung up the portal initially, and this shows the three epochs in the history of the CIPRES portal. CIPRES portal originally, now CIPRES Gateway. And in our original architecture, it was very simple, and it only offered a very restricted command line set. And some people came, they used it. And when we talked to them, they said, yeah, you know, we can kind of do something, but we really need more command line options if you're going to be serious. And you know, otherwise we really can't use the resource very much. And so we listened to that, and we took and so we made all the command line options that each code had available, and you can see there was an immediate uptick in job runs. And these are still running serially. But the reason we were able to do that in a fairly quick way is we had the generic software package from the NGBW project. So that project failed, but the generic design let us expose all the command line options in about 3 months for the codes that we were offering. So that was pretty exciting. And a lot of users came, and that was great. And then we got to the next stage where users are saying, oh, sure, we have all the command line options, but really, you're running them serially. You're not giving us much help. And at that point, Nancy Wilkins-Deere, who's the gateway lead at SDSC, and Wayne Pfeiffer, who's our HPC expert here, came to visit me and said, you really got to put this on XSEDE and make a gateway out of it and use parallel codes. And so this was a happy coincidence. So once we made parallel codes available, we started giving people really significant time savings, and our usage rates doubled again. So this was getting pretty exciting. Okay, so again, the generic software package was designed to ship jobs out to any generic resource, and so that was helpful to us. Again, we were able to incorporate ourselves into XSEDE resources fairly easy. So, and most of what I'll show next, starting at this epoch, this is where we're a gateway, where we're running parallel codes. If you look at usage after that time, the growth numbers are linear since our inception. And we've had about a 10-fold increase in the number of users per month. Well, let me start on the left. Okay, the black line shows the number of jobs submitted, and that's been increasing linearly since we began. The red line shows core hours. we call them SUs here. That's a core hour at unit priority, so it's a core hour. And for the most part, until recently, that usage has paralleled the number of jobs. So the number of jobs is increasing linearly. The number of core hours is, roughly increasing in parallel. And the usage is driven mostly by users. The amount used per user is not increasing dramatically. It might be increasing slightly. But anyway, the black line here shows total users. Oops, sorry. And the red line shows new users per month, which actually has a trend line now. It looks like it's starting to, the number of new users is increasing every month a little bit. But basically, we're being driven by new users, and not each user using more, but more and more users. And so our job has been mostly responding to that growth and responding to changing use cases in keeping up with the development. Okay. So now we're letting user behavior and usage created needs drive our improvements. Okay, so the first problem is too many users, and we had to respond to that. We had to create a tool set that gives us an ability to limit submissions from a given user account. So we had to impose limits determined in collaboration with XSEDE, and then tools to monitor the usage by each account automatically. And the important part was investing the users in that. When we started telling them we're going to limit the amount, they're come back to us and say, well, how do we know how much we're using? So we had to give them tools that would tell them what each job costs and what their SU consumption is. And users became very savvy very quickly when they knew it was a finite commodity. Then they use Cypress for certain things, but not everything. And so that's a really interesting thing. When you put a cost on something, it acquires a value to the user. And then we added the ability to charge to a user's personal XSEDE allocation. So people who have their own allocation can run as long as they want. Okay, so that was all infrastructure that we built. It was all necessary. And just to show you, like, this is really simple, but querying the database, finding out how much people have used to date, and just displaying it on their website, that's really all we needed to do to give them an investment in how it is that they use their resources. But at least then they're in control of it and have awareness of it. Okay. What other kinds of things did we run into? Well, users were allowed to run 2 week jobs on our resources, which was a policy innovation just for CIPRES, because the codes just needed to run that long. Users were demanding it. But when there were service interruptions, when our server went down, or when the machine went offline, the application would lose track of the job, and we'd have to fetch the results manually. So you have these 2 week long jobs, and the user lost track of them, so they just restart the job. So it's really boosting unnecessarily the amount of consumption that's going on. In response to that, we made the system more robust to that kind of failure by creating a set of daemons that will return the results robustly even with system outages. And it's really just a set of 3 daemons that we use. One is a submission daemon. We call it submit jobs D. When a user creates a job and submits it, it's put in the database in a running task table, and its progress is tracked in this table through the daemons. And so the submit daemon just finds the new tasks that are labeled as new. They submit them to the correct execution host, and then they change the status of the job to submitted. There it's over there baking on the execution host. And the second daemon, which is the check jobs daemon, will look for all the submitted tasks and poll the execution host to say, are you done yet? And when it's done, it'll set the bit to done and change its status in the, oops, I keep doing it'll change the status in the running task table to done. Okay, and once it's done, the third daemon takes over. It'll find the done tasks, it'll bring them over to the results database, and it will remove the job from a work queue. So this takes the job offline. This job is done. Not just done, but completed, no longer relevant. So that was very useful, and it saved us a lot of work in recovering results manually for people that had become lost, and it saved a lot of time. I think it saved 7 or 8% of all running jobs. Okay, so So that's one problem. Another problem that arises is, as I mentioned, biology's been going through an explosion in data size. And so the original system was designed for kilobyte data files. Those grew to megabytes, and now tens of megabytes, and now hundreds of megabytes at times. And the output, depending on the code you're running and the size of your input data, it grew from megabytes to gigabytes. And those things put stress on the system. So we had to continuously make software as subsequent increase choked out the system. And so the initial design of the Workbench software had these small files being read into memory multiple times. Not a very good design, but it wasn't a problem with kilobyte files. But as things grew, it started to mire things down, and we had to refactor the system to eliminate that. And then storage became a problem because database space is fairly expensive. So we did things that are not rocket science here, but things that required refactoring of the system. So we've refactored the database one time, so there are pointers to files out in file space rather than storing them in the database. We stored identical files only once, so there's a hash system now that keeps track of that, so all the pointers go to a single file. And then we started taking more draconian moves. We had to sunset accounts that were inactive for more than a year. And then moving gigabyte, super gigabyte files outside of the web application. We had to take all those steps in sequence. Oops. And one other thing we had to do to try to save storage space is limit users to 150 gigabytes of data storage. And if you offer people storage space where it's infinite and indefinite, you can store it here as long as you want. No one ever deletes data. Why would you? It's time that you could save for doing something else. And so the data checks in, but it never checks out. And so data just continues to grow. And that eventually becomes a burdensome expense, even though the data sets weren't super huge to begin with. So that's an issue we had to contend. And so as with SU use, there's a really simple idea of giving users an idea of what their usage level is. And then if they exceed the level that we wish to allow, we just prevent them from submitting further jobs until they've removed some of their stored data. It's not a step we'd like to take, but it's just a matter of survival. Okay, let me talk about when we implemented codes that routinely produce gigabyte-sized files. Going back to our daemon system, I can show you why that became problematic. Looking at our three daemons again, the final daemon, the load results daemon, was impacted by this in the following way. The load results daemon is supposed to find the done tasks, transfer the results to the database, and then remove the job from the work queue. But it runs every 5 minutes or so. So if the transfer is still in progress, the job's still in the work queue and it's still marked done. So load results sees that file again and starts up a second transfer again. And pretty soon you've got multiple transfers of the same file. None of them will ever complete, and the system's brought to a standstill. So our solution to that, again, not necessarily elegant, but it worked, is when load results goes to look for completed tasks, it first asks, how big are the results? And if they're above a certain size, we move them outside of the system. We don't transfer them back to the database and gum everything up, but rather we elected to move them to a cloud storage facility that we have at SDSC. And there's a separate system that'll return users a link where they can download them, but they don't have the convenience of being able to access them from within the user interface any longer. So it's not perpetual storage, but rather short-term storage for them to download. And they're returned currently by HTTP, which isn't super ideal. But it has been, we have been able to get results back to everyone with that system. And so far, it's been really important. We've had more than 500 users return their files by this sort of kludgy return mechanism. Okay. And the fourth step is managing challenges that threaten productivity of high-end users. They're the people we really need to court and keep happy. They drive the changes that we need to make. And I'll just touch on these for a second. For one thing, grid FTP, which is the lingua franca for file system movement in most of XSEDE, it really wasn't reliable enough for under high load. So we moved to local file systems, and initially to Lustre, and I'll show you that we moved off Lustre as well. And under load, things like a MySQL bug prevented the database connections from releasing. We had to refactor the database. And then I mentioned Lustre. Lustre is really not very good for biology codes. It's not good for codes that are written to really frequently. And the reason seems to be there's a single metadata server on the Lustre system we were using. And what happens is you see this little surge here in mid-2011 that happened when we were still using the Lustre system. And you see the longest jobs that we run are ones that tend to defeat Lustre or cause Lustre to seize up. And so what happens is that, again, when a user's job fails unexpectedly, they immediately restart it. And so you get this, again, this cascade of people restarting jobs that have failed, getting them to run again. And your usage, your core hours per job go way up because all the long jobs are being repeated over and over again and failing near the end. Okay, so that's another kind of solution. And running a gateway is really interesting. It's when these problems occur, they're frantic, and you deal with them in a fire drill mode. You try to come up with a really fast solution that's going to keep the system up. You don't want to take the system down. You try to have it keep working while you're making the changes. And in our average week, 30 to 45% of developer time, and often more, is spent dealing with these kinds of issues that arise. And some days and weeks, you're really not making any headway on what you hope to do as a developer. You're just trying to keep the system going and the lights on. But when you're in a production group, that's your main thing, is to keep the users happy. Okay. A couple other things we do briefly. We stay in touch with our community. We give people forums. They can submit to us individually. I communicate a lot with users, a couple hours a day, I'd say. And then we have the Google group, and then we have the annual survey. And the idea is just to give many ways for people to give us feedback. And when the community loves you, like when we send out a survey, some people reposted it on their blog post for the Phylogenetics community, and that's always gratifying. Okay, and finally, embracing customer service. Most of my time interacting with users is spent this way, and we provide the mechanisms I mentioned for people to give us feedback. And you have to do this stuff. You have to help people. There's a lot of user error, a lot of patience involved, but our goals are to respond within 24 hours, to keep the communication helpful and supportive, and really make it clear that trouble reports are a gift and not an annoyance. So every response to every user starts with "thank you for reporting that issue," even if it's clearly a user error, just because it's like it just seems to work. Okay, so that's tactics. Let me talk for a minute or two about, well, a couple more minutes, about the aspirational part of what we do, where we'd like to go with this and what we'd like to see happen, because that's probably what you all think about more than anything. And in our aspirations, a couple of years ago when I spoke in this forum, I talked about what we'd hoped to do was to create a set of RESTful services. And so let me tell you the motivation and where we've gotten with that. Within the phylogenetics community, there are a number of desktop applications that are very highly evolved, some less highly evolved, but still useful. Time's been invested in them, people use them, and spend the time learning to use them, but they're only able to run on the available resources of a laptop or a desktop. So when you get into these high-end computations, it's like the value of the software is threatened. So what we'd like to do is create tools to let those kinds of applications submit their jobs high-end computing without leaving the environment. And then there are other projects that aggregate lots of services. BioKepler is one. It's a workflow tool that's meant to support genomics. And the National Center for Genomic Analysis Support has the same mission. These people want to provide a single resource for people to do their genomics work. And so one thing we're trying to do is incorporate our HPC services for phylogenetics into that, into those environments. Okay. And so the NSF gave us some funding. When I talked a couple of years ago, we just received the funding to begin incorporating the ability to run these jobs on HPC resources, parallel codes, community codes, through various different applications. And we made partnerships with a set of these applications to try to get our codes into those applications so people could use them in the environment. And one of our partners was Morphobank. Morphobank actually doesn't use DNA sequencing. Morphobank uses morphological features to create the matrices. So instead of DNA letters, you'll have measurements of lengths, or you might have O's and 1s, whether you have a feature or don't have it. Or there might be multiple kinds, so 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, that kind of numbering, but it's the same kind of matrix used in the same kind of analysis. And the Morphobank tool is very sophisticated for visualizing and accessing and scoring these and creating these matrices. But and it serves its community well, but it really has no concept of trees or tree inference. So you can build this huge matrix, but you can't go the next step and say, how's this working out? And get feedback. Is this the tree I was expecting? And go back and collect more data if you need to. And so what we did is expose through Morphobank, through the RESTful services, the ability to submit to XSEDE the jobs that these people need to run. And so in their website now, there's a new web form that people can populate, and they can run their jobs right within Morphobank. So this is a nice thing for them. Another use case is the desktop application. Mesquite is a very sophisticated user tool that allows people to create their data sets for analysis, so pre-tree analysis, and then post-tree analysis, visualizing the trees and manipulating them, seeing how they like them. And it does have tools for tree inference, but they're confined again, like I said, to the desktop. So if you look at Mesquite, this is what it looks like. It's a very highly sophisticated visualization environment. This is showing one matrix. So again, the REST API does the same thing. It allows them, or will allow them, it's not quite in production yet, but it will allow them to submit their jobs through the CRA to XSEDE resources. And so the idea here is to prolong the life of these very complex software environments by giving them the computational resources, the one part that they're missing. Okay. A final use case is advanced people who work in phylogenetics. They're comfortable with scripting, and they find, you know, point-and-click deployment interfaces extremely restrictive and tedious. Got some requests from them. The ability to run many jobs simultaneously. Someone just emailed me and said, I'd like to run 800 jobs simultaneously, and if you don't want to have a party of 40 people getting that done, you want to get it in reasonable time. That's pretty difficult with our current interface. But they also want to create ad hoc workflows. So, and what they don't want to do is do this all on a single point-and-click basis. So, so we're trying to address that as well. You know, anyone with scripting tools, anyone with scripting language knowledge, Python or Perl or Java, you know, can access the. You can, provide some examples and let people get started doing that kind of work. And how are we succeeding with this? Well, we now have 5 partners that are exposing our RESTful services, and I've listed those here. I won't read them to you, but and there are 3 more that are about to come online. So those are being adopted, and that's pretty exciting. And we're hopeful that we will increase the lifetime of those. I think I covered this already. The idea is it preserves the investment people have made in developing and learning to use these environments and make the interaction more flexible. But what's not working is that where are the scripters? We really don't have a bunch of people writing scripts And the question is, where did we miss the boat there? How can we attract those people? And our thinking right now is maybe this REST API provides too high of a barrier to entry. And let me show you why I think that's true. The way our system works and why it's scalable in terms of adding new codes for the regular interface, the browser interface, is we have a tool XML sheet for each tool interface, and the interface that generates a web form is generated from that, and a lot of other code is generated for it. So there's front-end validation with JavaScript that's generated from the tool XML. There's a back-end validation that confirms when you submit, and the way it works is the user populates the web form, and through the front-end validation, the values that are entered are turned into a parameter map that specifies everything that's needed to run the job from the command line. Any auxiliary files that are needed, all that stuff's created on after backend, and it's submitted to the resource through a command line. Okay, so what's the problem with that for a REST interface? It's like we don't allow people to just submit plain text. We don't allow people to create an arbitrary command line because of the security risk of putting that kind of access out for an HPC, because we're just hanging out there. Anyone can come and register and make an account. So we can't really do that. And so the height of the barrier comes from the fact that someone's got to create a REST client that, by reading this XML document and inferring what the required parameters are, or we can provide them with a very long set of parameters that need to be required. And if you stick with defaults, it's simple, but if you're doing something complex, you have to work at it a bit. And so creating, the responsibility of the REST client is to populate the parameter map, which already was happening from a lot of generated code, and it has to pass through the backend validation. So we're thinking maybe that's just a little too high of a barrier. And one way we could address it, what next? If we could create a JavaScript, a GUI generator, that will take the tool XML and generate the form, so the user can use it to submit, to create something that helps them submit. It seems kind of counterintuitive to have a REST service that has to work that way. What are the other options that we thought about when you look at the requirements? You want to create and run many jobs simultaneously. You want to create ad hoc workflows. Many people ask us for access to scripting languages. So where do we want to go with that? And what we're proposing to do now is, I don't know if you all are familiar with the Ipython or Jupyter notebook, but what we're proposing and what we like about this wonderful project is we think it would be a really great front end for an advanced user for a gateway. And let me just, for those of you who don't know about it, let me just run through quickly what it does and what I think is cool about it. It's a web server that you create a notebook. It's a file. It's simple. It's easy to share. Anyone who can get onto our Jupyter server can, with the software required, can run your workflow. So it's easy to share, and it interleaves text for comments and live code cells, which can be edited. And you step through it by using control at the top. By pushing the little right-facing arrow, you can step through the control cells, and the control cells run and come back with results. So this is a really wonderful, for people like me who are on the margins as coders, this is really nice because people can create, comment on, you can modify it. And so here is an example of what we're thinking is, we have a quick start guide that shows you how to use the Python Cypress REST API. And here all the instructions are given, and where you need to modify, like adding your own username and your own password. Those kinds of things can be entered in the code cell, and the user deploys them, cell by cell, and gets immediate feedback on what worked and what didn't. So if they made a mistake, they can go on. And we think this is really exciting, both for learning how to use the REST API, but also as a way forward for Cypress to meet the needs of these more advanced users who want more flexibility. If Python and R are the main languages used in phylogenetics currently, and the Jupyter project offers many languages. It's taking Ipython and making it into a language language agnostic platform. So there are some problems to solve in making this a gateway interface, but we really like the concept, and we like how it's easy to share, and we like how useful it is as a teaching tool. So, I think I've already covered these, but the properties that are useful, you know, like I said, it's easy to modify and share workflows. You can store it as a shareable file. We can provide a utility, you know, a place where people can share, control how they share them. A number of scripting languages are used, including the ones that are important for phylogenetics research. And it supports creating and modifying figures interactively through those code cells. That it can spawn them and make them ready for publication as you wish. You can also spawn GUIs through that notebook. The tools are there to do that. So for me, it's very exciting what this will do. And so our goal now is to create a CIPRES Notebook Environment, a place where people can come and use these notebooks. We'll support notebooks in R and in Python, at least. You know, if more use cases, if more languages are needed, we can add them. And we can provide a central starting notebook, a place where there's a collection of phylogenetic codes. Some of these are hard to install and buggy, so we can get them installed and ready for users to use. And then they'll be able to run these things in languages they're comfortable with interactively, which no one can do, to my knowledge, currently in any phylogenetics website, because of the risks involved in giving people that kind of access. And then, you know, providing tools for sharing the notebooks with each other, and, you know, for teaching purposes. There's just a lot of ways this could go really well. And again, they'll have the ability to submit through our REST API. Will also ultimately give them the ability to submit through virtual HPC clusters on the Comet machine here at SDSC. So that's where we're headed with that. The challenges to that, you know, as I mentioned, we don't really like giving people the ability to submit arbitrary code to our machines right now, because we're hanging there open to the world. And we'll have to change that. I mean, it's just a command decision. It's like, we're going to have to vet users in a more serious way to give them this kind of access and have them be accountable for the things that they're doing. But I don't think that's a huge barrier. I just think it'll change the way we work a little bit, and people will be a little delayed in getting vetted to get their accounts. And the second problem is we strictly control how jobs are configured, so they're running correctly and efficiently on our resources. And we'll have to do some back-end tools that check people's configurations to make sure they're reasonable and allowed. But I think with sophisticated users that we're trying to attract, that's not an end-of-the-world kind of problem either. I think that's something we can do, and there are tools available to monitor how efficiently jobs are running, to alarm us or alert us if things are going badly. There are some other challenges, but those are the two major ones that have come to mind. Okay, so that's my whole story. That's where we'd like to go with Cypress, and we'd like to see gateways doing that for the more sophisticated users, and we think it can happen. Just to say, I do user service and I give talks and stuff, but the people who really are in the trenches, who really built this stuff, this wonderful application, are here. Terry Schwartz is the lead developer, and she's the heart and soul of the project. She's been with me since day one, and very talented. And Wayne Pfeiffer, who got me started understanding what parallel codes. He came in patiently, explained it to in my office once, and we went from there, and that's why Cypress really exists today as a useful thing that it is. And then Paul and Mona also have contributed to database and interface development, respectively, and invaluable in a bunch of the things that we do. So that's my story. I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have questions.